So in today's video, we're looking at what made Battlefield 4 great versus what made Battlefield 5 fail and flop. Now I think this can be boiled down to a number of different reasons. Let's just kick things off with reason one, which I think is the poor allocation of resources. Firestorm is what stands out here. Firestorm seemed just like such a rushed project. Firestorm launched with a myriad of bugs on launch, the weapon pickup system was terrible, and the gameplay just really wasn't that fun. I remember the LMGs and snipers being the only really viable weapons, as the majority of the assault rifles had too small of clips to actually even kill a single opponent with armor on, no matter a whole squad coming at you. Now COD does this very well, with almost all the multiplayer weapons being viable, or at least customizable to be viable in the Warzone game mode. There was crossover. Call of Duty Warzone really does feel like a COD game, whereas Firestorm always felt like a completely different experience to your typical Battlefield game. Now I've got no problem with companies innovating with new ideas, but what it can't do is draw away from the fundamentals of what made that gameplay enjoyable in the first place. BF4 released on October 2013, and by December 2013 China Rising had been released with 4 new maps. By February, on all consoles, Second Assault had been released with 4 new maps from BF3. Now I appreciate these maps were a rework from BF3 maps like Metro and Firestorm, but either way it was 8 new maps within the first 4 or 5 months of launch. Compare that to Battlefield 5, within the first 7 months we'd only got 2 new multiplayer maps and the game mode Firestorm released. And this is where the problem lies, is that Firestorm seemed to draw resources from the development of what made Battlefield great and what people loved about Battlefield in the first place. This is what COD actually got right. They continued to add multiplayer content alongside the Call of Duty Warzone game mode, which made both a success. With Battlefield 5, the development of Firestorm really did seem to suck the life out of the development of BF5's multiplayer. Fundamentally, the idea of Firestorm was flawed right off the bat because it was locked behind a paywall. Now, I get why they allocated resources to the Battle Royale genre after seeing how well Fortnite did. However, the fact that it was behind a paywall meant they already had cut numbers down to people that owned Battlefield 5, and sales of Battlefield 5 were already low and below expectations of launch, so they really limited the amount of people that had exposure to the Firestorm game mode. With that being really evident, because it was actually quite difficult to find the game later on in Firestorm. If they even wanted to have a modicum of success, they needed to make this free to play to draw players into the franchise. Now, not to say this would have worked alone, as previously mentioned, there were many problems that needed to be addressed with the game mode itself. And if they wanted to make any money off skins, I mean any money off the skins, they really dramatically needed to improve as well, because they all practically look the same. But I think it would have been a start, and I think with continued development and a free-to-play Firestorm, the game mode could have seen success, especially as Firestorm really did have a unique selling point, which was the vehicle gameplay that is kind of exclusive to the Battlefield franchise, or at least Battlefield's been seen in the past as doing vehicle gameplay exceptionally well. Now, we touched on content and how much content was being pushed out, and BF4 did this right with 8 maps being released in the first 5 months, which is impressive. Now, this might be controversial, but I think one of the main issues was BF5 actually scrapped the premium service, which obviously meant they had less money for the development of new DLC. Personally, I'd have rather paid £40 on top of the base game of £50, which I appreciate is a steep price, for a completed Battlefield 5 game with constant content update for multiplayer for the foreseeable future, 3-4 years development cycle, rather than what we got, then putting all their eggs in one basket of Firestorm in the hope that they can bring money in from skins, not getting the money in from skins and cosmetic purchases, and then having no money to develop the multiplayer experience. Now, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I think I'd much rather them even implemented premium later on, just so we could have some DLC and the game stay alive. I think a further problem with the game was the map design. Battlefield 4 maps felt far less linear, in my opinion, than Battlefield 5 maps. Battlefield 5 maps often were much larger, yes, but in large part would also contain just open ground, leading to very uninteresting gameplay. Now, this may be due to the context of World War II battles and where they took place. However, at the end of the day, it just produces less interesting gameplay. Like some of my favourite maps from BF4, Zavod, Propaganda, Pearl Market, Operation Outbreak. Yes, they had some open spaces, but a lot of it was, in and around buildings, market towns, lots of destruction. It made for less linear gameplay, People were coming at you from all angles, and it was actually really, really fun. Now, don't get me wrong, there were some maps I wasn't so keen on in BF4, like Road Transmission, but again, that was quite an open one for a majority. Now, that just might be my personal preference on map type, but I think maps that were a little bit more densely populated provided more interesting gameplay experiences. Now, if you look at BF5, some of those maps were just stupidly open. Hamada rings bells here. Like, if you remember this map, like, it wasn't possible really to get around without a vehicle, or if you did decide to walk it, you'd be running for like 2 or 3 minutes before you came into any enemies, and you might just die when you get there, you know. Aerodrome's another one that was particularly sparse, and even Panzerstorm as well, the first DLC map, was pretty sparsely populated. Now, again, on BF5, there were some good maps from Mauritius, Rings a Bell, or even Arras, and even though that did have some open spaces, I thought it played exceptionally well in that central town area around the church. It was quite an enjoyable experience there. But I think the overall map design in BF4 was much more well thought out and intricate than its BF5 counterpart. Now, a lot of people think that the downfall of BF5 was it was pumped out too quickly because there was a lot of problems on launch, but this is quite typical of Battlefield. Like, if you remember Battlefield 4, there was also a lot of bugs on launch in Battlefield 4, but the difference with Battlefield 4 is they addressed these by pushing out more and more content and more bug updates, and by the end of BF4, it's actually a pretty good game. Now, there are some issues, yes, of course, but by the end, BF4 for its time was a pretty well-rounded and polished game. Now, this may be due to the fact that back in the day, if you remember, BF4 had a class action lawsuit brought against it for releasing misleading statements about the quality of BF4 on its release. And this may be one of the reasons why BF4 had those constant content updates and bug fixes, as they were also trying to stay off a class action lawsuit. Alternatively, it could have been the developers at the time were more interested in fixing the bugs. But either way, it doesn't really matter the reasoning. All that matters is the outcome, and BF4 was quite polished by the end. Now, compare that to BF5, I think you can look at the attitude some of the developers had before the launch, with the EA Chief Creative Officer even saying to the community they have 2 choices, either accept it or don't buy the game, and further stating he is fine with either or. Now, this doesn't send fantastic signals to the community about where Battlefield 5 is heading. Not only did it show at the time that they weren't really interested in listening to community feedback, I think what's even worse is the second part of that statement, is that the EA Chief Creative Officer was fine with either or. He was fine with people buying the game or not buying the game. And surely fundamentally, as the Chief Creative Officer of EA, you should be concerned and not fine with people not buying your game. So I think there are the differences with BF4. BF4 was quite on top of fixing the game, even though it did come out on a poor state, possibly due to different developers at the time or the fact that a class action lawsuit was against them. Whereas BF5 definitely failed at the start, and it kind of continued throughout, really, that there was a more laissez-faire approach to the fixing of the game off launch. I think one of the major problems as well, maybe the most fundamental one, was the gunplay was just not as satisfying. In BF5, there was a very select few weapons that were really viable. Some of the weapons were actually dog tier. Now, I've been playing BF4 recently for the last week and a half, and I get killed by a whole host of different weaponry, and it really does spice up the game. But it's not just that, it's the fact that for some reason, and I can't put my finger on it, just the gunplay in BF4 and BF3 for that fact just felt so much more satisfying than the gunplay in BF1 and BF5. Now, this might be due to my personal preferences around modern day shooters, but also I think you can make World War 1 and World War 2 games satisfying to play. You know, take Call of Duty 5, COD 5. That was, all in all, a pretty fun experience, and the gameplay did feel quite satisfying on that game, even though it was set in a World War 1, World War 2 time period. Now, I appreciate they might be limited by the context of the time, World War 1 or World War 2, in the terms of the weapons they can bring out, but EA developers and creators have consistently said through the development of BF5 and even prior to it that they were placing gameplay experience and having a good time over realism in the game. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole issues around the trailer and women being in the trailer and on the front line, because that's something I don't really want to touch on. But I remember there was a big uproar in the community about that, and this is when that statement came out, is that they're placing gameplay enjoyment over realism. And if that's true, I think they could have tweaked some of the guns or made the gunplay a little bit more enjoyable at the sacrifice of realism, if that's what they were going for. If they wanted to go for realism, then fine, but it seems like they're in this limbo where some things were historically accurate and just not that fun to play with, while other things were just historically inaccurate. And yeah, there just seemed to be a mishmash there that didn't really make much sense. And I think finally BF5 content just stopped too early in the cycle. They gave up on this game too early. I think they had a number of different options. I think if they continue to improve Firestorm by making it free to play, and they really did have a keyhole in the market, like a standout factor with Firestorm because of that vehicle gameplay. Like yes, other battle royales implement some vehicle gameplay, but Battlefield has been known throughout time to really master that, and if they got that right, it really could have differentiated themselves from other battle royales. But unfortunately they gave up and scrapped that project, and in turn all those resources that got allocated to Firestorm were then not allocated to the core fundamentals of what made Battlefield multiplayer fun in the first place. And from there it just kind of spiraled to the point where they had no more money for development. And at the end of the day, they are a business and they need to make money, but I think it would have been nice to see them try and either pick to resurrect Firestorm or completely scrap Firestorm and really focus on the multiplayer. But again, it goes back to this limbo point. They kind of tried to do both, but they did both kind of half-heartedly, and it ended up just not working. So unfortunately for Battlefield 5, the content is ending this summer, as most of you will know. But I just thought I'd give a little bit of breakdown of where I thought Battlefield 5 went wrong, where Battlefield 4 went well, and kind of comparing Battlefield 5 to some of its more recent counterparts, most notably Call of Duty. If you did enjoy this, please don't forget to like and subscribe to keep up with more content. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts in the comments to why you think Battlefield 5 went so poorly and Battlefield 4 went so great, or vice versa. I don't think there'll be many people that argue vice versa, but I'd be interested to hear it. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this video, and yeah, I'll see you on the next one. Peace out.